Dad flipped a rack of ribs and pointed a pair of steel tongs at a half circle of relatives like he was briefing troops before a mission. I'm telling you, those drill sergeants were animals back then, he said. Not like today. We had one guy quit before breakfast on day 3. Another guy cried himself to sleep every night for 2 weeks. A few people laughed. A few nodded. Nobody questioned him. They never did. The smell of charcoal, barbecue sauce, and lighter fluid hung over the backyard, while Roland Kensington delivered the same story he'd been performing for most of my life. Every Labor Day, every 4th of July, every birthday that somehow ended near a grill, he found a way back to Army basic training. According to him, it was less a training course and more of a survival horror movie. The mud was always colder. The drill sergeants were always meaner. The recruits were always weaker. And somehow Dad was always the toughest man who ever walked through the gates. I stood near a large blue cooler with a bottle of water in my hand. Jeans, gray t-shirt, no rank on display, no reason for anyone at the cookout to know what I did for a living. That was intentional. People treat you differently when they find out you're a major, especially family. Dad glanced toward me while pulling a tray of burgers from the grill. His eyes narrowed slightly. That usually happened when he noticed I wasn't participating in the worship service. You remember that story, Sloan? He asked loudly. I smiled. Which one? A few cousins chuckled. Dad grinned. The one where real soldiers learned what suffering actually looked like. There it was, not the insult, the warm-up. He loved warm-ups. My Aunt Karen grabbed a paper plate and shook her head. Roland's probably told that story 50 times. Only 50? Dad said. Must have been a short year. More laughter. He enjoyed an audience the way some people enjoy oxygen. The bigger the crowd, the bigger the performance. I took a sip of water and watched. Not because I was impressed, not because I was annoyed. Because patterns are easier to see when you stop reacting to them. Dad's stories weren't really about basic training. They were about authority. Every version ended the same way. He survived. Everyone else failed. Therefore, his opinion mattered more. His rules mattered more. His judgment mattered more. The military story was just the packaging. The message underneath never changed. I watched him point at various family members while assigning imaginary military ratings. My cousin Evan would never make it through week 1. My uncle Frank would get recycled for complaining. My nephew Mason was too addicted to video games. The crowd laughed along. Nobody noticed the target kept moving. Then Dad looked directly at me. Perfect timing. Although, he said, Sloane's got military experience too. A few heads turned. Here we go. My cousin Rachel smiled. Oh right, you're still in the Army, aren't you? Yes. Dad barked a laugh. Army is a broad term these days. Several people exchanged uncertain looks. He enjoyed creating those moments. The little pause before the punchline. The toughest thing in her office is probably a stapler. A couple people laughed automatically. Dad continued. I bet her biggest combat injury is a paper cut. More laughter. Not cruel laughter. Uncomfortable laughter. The kind people use when they aren't sure if they're supposed to laugh. I unscrewed my water bottle, took another sip. That disappointed him. He preferred resistance. Resistance gave him something to conquer. Silence forced him to keep talking. And when Dad kept talking, he usually revealed more than he intended. You know, he continued, turning back toward the grill, there's a difference between military service and military service. My uncle raised an eyebrow. What does that mean? Dad shrugged. Some people earn stories. He flipped a burger. Some people earn office chairs. There it was, cleaner than usual, sharper than usual. The guests shifted awkwardly. A few glanced toward me, waiting, expecting, maybe hoping for an argument. They weren't going to get one. The truth was simple. Dad had spent so many years building his legend that he couldn't have a normal conversation anymore. Everything became a competition. Every achievement became a threat. Every gathering became a stage, especially when I was there. I looked across the backyard. Daphne stood near the patio table, arranging cupcakes she'd bought from a bakery called Sweet Orchard Kitchen. The receipt was still sticking out of the box, $42.87. She hadn't said much all afternoon. She mostly stayed close to Dad. That wasn't surprising. Being his favorite child came with responsibilities. You had to keep believing the story. You had to keep clapping. You had to keep pretending the Emperor's clothes looked fantastic. Dad suddenly pointed a spatula toward me. The backyard quieted, slightly. I smiled. Paperwork. A few people laughed. Dad laughed hardest. See, honest answer. I nodded. Very honest. because technically it was. There was paperwork, a lot of paperwork. The military loves paperwork almost as much as it loves acronyms, forms, reports, evaluations, recommendations, policy reviews, endless paperwork. Dad looked pleased with himself, like he'd scored a point. I let him have it. For now, the afternoon heat pressed against the backyard, while smoke drifted over the fence into the neighboring yard. Someone turned up the music. Kids chased each other through the grass. Plates filled with burgers and ribs. From a distance, it looked like a perfectly normal family gathering. But standing there beside that cooler, watching my father perform his favorite legend for another audience, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. He wasn't telling the story because he loved the army. He wasn't telling it because he missed his youth. He wasn't even telling it because he believed it. He was telling it because the story was the only thing holding up the version of himself he wanted everyone else to see. And that realization made the rest of the afternoon much more interesting. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone build their entire identity around a story that never quite added up? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy real family stories about truth, dignity, and the moment masks finally slip, remember our exclusive stories go live every day at 8:30 a.m. ET and 1:30 p.m. ET. Make us part of your daily routine, and I'll see you at the next premiere. Daphne brushed a strand of hair behind her ear and tapped a plastic fork against her lemonade cup. I actually have some news. The conversations around the patio slowed. Dad immediately turned toward her. Not because he knew what she was about to say, because Daphne had spent her entire life delivering the kind of news he liked hearing. She stood beside him near the grill. The timing wasn't accidental. Nothing made Dad happier than having an audience. I got accepted, she said. A few relatives leaned forward. Accepted where? Aunt Karen asked. Daphne smiled. The Accelerated Officer Candidate Program. The backyard erupted. Cheers. Applause. Several cousins started congratulating her before she could finish explaining. Even I smiled. Getting accepted wasn't easy. The application process alone eliminated plenty of qualified candidates. Medical screenings, background checks, physical evaluations, interviews, paperwork that could bury a small city. Daphne had worked hard for it. That part was true. Dad wrapped an arm around her shoulders before anyone else could. There she is. He practically glowed. My girl, Daphne laughed. Dad looked around the gathering like he'd personally engineered the achievement. That's Kensington Grit. There it was. The family slogan. Kensington Grit. A phrase that somehow always meant whatever Dad needed it to mean. Won a football game? Kensington Grit. Finished college? Kensington Grit. Parallel parked on the first attempt? Apparently Kensington Grit. Dad pointed at Daphne. She's got what it takes. Several relatives nodded. She's always been tough, Uncle Frank said. Dad immediately took control of the narrative. Because she's willing to suffer. I almost laughed into my water bottle. Dad talked about suffering the way some people talk about stock investments. Like he'd cornered the market. Most people quit when things get uncomfortable, he continued. Not Daphne. The crowd listened. Daphne stood proudly beside him. And for a second, I felt genuinely happy for her. Not because of Dad, despite him. She'd spent years chasing his approval. Years. Every report card, every soccer game, every scholarship application, every achievement was another coin dropped into a machine that rarely paid out. Today, she finally got something back. Then Dad looked at me. Of course he did. The spotlight could never stay on someone else for long, especially if I was nearby. You know what I love most about this, he said. Nobody answered. That never stopped him. Daphne's going to experience real military life. The word real landed exactly where he wanted it to. Several people glanced toward me. Dad smiled. Not office military. There were a few uncomfortable chuckles. He wasn't finished, not even close. She's going into the mud. His voice grew louder. The cold, louder. The pressure, louder. The kind of environment that shows who people really are. A cousin shifted awkwardly. Someone opened another soda. I could practically feel people hoping he'd stop. Dad never stopped. Not when he had momentum. Daphne looked slightly uncomfortable now. Not enough to interrupt him, just enough to notice. Then came the line. The one that explained 20 years of our relationship better than any therapy session ever could. He looked me up and down. Slowly, like he was inspecting equipment. Don't try to give your sister advice. Sloan. The backyard became very quiet. You couldn't survive basic training if your life depended on it. Silence. Then a few nervous laughs. Not because the joke was funny, because people panic when family dysfunction arrives without warning. I took another sip of water. Dad seemed disappointed by the lack of reaction. He expected a defense, an argument, anything. Instead, I looked at Daphne. She gave me a small smile. Not cruel, not exactly, just confident. The smile of someone who believed she had finally earned a higher place in the family hierarchy. I recognized it immediately. Dad had spent years teaching us that love was competitive. When one child moved up, another had to move down. Daphne hadn't invented that system. She'd grown up inside it, same as me. The difference was that she'd learned to play. I never did. You'll see, Dad told her. Basic training changes people. I nearly corrected him. Officer candidate programs weren't basic training. Different pipelines, different objectives, different evaluations. But accuracy had never been the point of these conversations. My father preferred mythology. Facts tended to ruin the mood. Daphne smiled again. I think I'll be okay. Oh, you'll do more than okay. Dad pointed toward her. You've got the toughness. Then he nodded toward me. You got the right genes. A few relatives winced. Even he seemed unaware of how ridiculous the statement sounded. Apparently, I had inherited every defective gene available. Convenient. I watched Daphne accept the praise, watched her stand a little taller, watched her absorb years of validation she'd been starving for. And for the first time all afternoon, I wasn't annoyed. I wasn't offended. I wasn't even angry. I felt sorry for her, not because she got accepted. That achievement was real, not because she was Dad's favorite. That wasn't her fault. I felt sorry because she believed the source. She believed the stories. She believed the man standing beside her. The same man who had built an entire identity around tales of impossible toughness. The same man who acted like military service was a private club only he truly understood. The same man whose stories somehow became more dramatic every year. She was preparing to step into one of the most demanding experiences of her life while trusting guidance from someone who treated reality like a rough draft. That worried me, more than I wanted to admit. Dad resumed talking. The crowd gradually relaxed. Food started moving again. People returned to their conversations. But I noticed something interesting. Daphne kept glancing toward him, waiting for more approval, waiting for another compliment, waiting for the next confirmation that she had finally become the child he wanted. And every time he delivered one, she brightened. Just a little, like someone checking their phone for a message that might never arrive. I looked away. Because I knew something she didn't. Military training doesn't care about family legends. It doesn't care about favorite children. It doesn't care about stories told around a grill. The system measures reality, and reality is brutally honest. A few days later, I walked through the secured entrance of a building where reality was measured for a living. A security gate clicked open after my badge cleared the scanner for the second time that morning. The building looked exactly like every other government facility in America. Neutral walls, fluorescent lights, coffee that tasted like punishment. Nobody would ever mistake it for something important. Which was probably the point. Most people imagine military power as tanks, helicopters, and soldiers kicking down doors. Very few people think about conference rooms, PowerPoint slides, statistical models, attrition reports. The Army runs on paperwork long before it runs on bullets. I stepped into a briefing room carrying a tablet and a binder thick enough to stop a small caliber round. 3 colonels were already seated. A civilian behavioral scientist was reviewing data on a large screen. Nobody cared about titles here. Nobody cared about family reputations. Nobody cared about who got the biggest applause at a Labor Day cookout. The only thing that mattered was whether the numbers worked. Morning, Major Kensington, Colonel Reeves said. Morning, he pointed toward the screen. We've got revised resilience metrics from Fort Jackson. I sat down. The meeting immediately started. No small talk, no stories, no mythology, just reality. A chart appeared on the screen: sleep performance degradation, cognitive decision-making accuracy, stress adaptation rates, physical recovery windows, hundreds of recruits, thousands of data points, years of research. The civilian scientist adjusted his glasses. We're seeing a 7-point improvement in retention after the Phase 2 modifications. I nodded. That was encouraging. Because those modifications had come from my team. And my team reported directly to me. Back at family gatherings, Dad loved calling my work a desk job. Technically, he wasn't wrong. I spent a lot of time behind a desk. So did surgeons. So did intelligence analysts. So did the people who designed military satellites. The location of the chair wasn't the important part. The decisions made from it were. After the meeting ended, I walked back to my office and dropped my binder onto the desk. My nameplate sat beside a stack of training manuals. Major Sloan Kensington. TRADOC. Training and Doctrine Command. The place responsible for figuring out how soldiers should be trained before they ever reach a battlefield. Most civilians had never heard of TRADOC. That was fine. If we did our jobs correctly, nobody noticed us. They only noticed the soldiers we produced. I sat down and opened a document marked Revision Draft 6.4, 217 pages. Every page mattered. Because basic combat training isn't designed to make people comfortable. It's designed to reveal what happens when comfort disappears. People hear stories about mud pits and obstacle courses. Those make great movies. The reality is much more complicated. A recruit can push through physical pain for a surprisingly long time. Mental fatigue is harder, isolation is harder, self-doubt is harder, uncertainty is harder. The challenge isn't breaking people. Any idiot can break people. The challenge is rebuilding them stronger afterward. That's where the science begins. I opened another report. Environmental stress response testing. One section covered cold weather exposure variables. Another covered sleep disruption cycles. Another examined performance degradation after prolonged physical exertion. People like Dad love talking about mud. I knew the exact temperature range where mud stopped being uncomfortable and started affecting decision-making performance. I knew how long a sleep deficit could impair judgment before safety became a concern. I knew which training events produced the highest psychological stress and which ones only looked intimidating from the outside. Because my team measured everything, not to make training cruel, to make it effective. There was a difference. A huge difference. Somebody has to answer difficult questions before young men and women are sent into dangerous situations. Can they function under pressure? Can they make decisions while exhausted? Can they work as a team when everything hurts? Can they keep moving when nobody is cheering for them? Those questions aren't theoretical. Sometimes they become life and death. That's why I never argued with Dad. Not because I lacked confidence. Because confidence wasn't the issue. Imagine a man spending 20 years bragging about how fast he can drive. Then imagine explaining vehicle dynamics to him while designing race cars for a living. At some point, the conversation becomes pointless. I didn't need his validation. I already knew what I did. Around noon, my assistant knocked on the door. "Major? Come in." She stepped inside carrying a folder. "Command wants your recommendation package before 1400. "Of course they do," she laughed. Apparently deadlines build character. That's what people say when they're creating problems for someone else. She grinned and left. I returned to the folder. The recommendation package involved updating several basic combat training protocols, scheduled for implementation the following quarter. Thousands of future recruits would experience changes resulting from decisions made in this room. That responsibility never became normal. It shouldn't. If it ever feels normal, you're probably the wrong person for the job. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. For a brief moment, I thought about Dad standing beside that grill, talking about freezing mud, talking about suffering, talking about toughness. The funny part was that he treated hardship like a trophy, something to display, something to brag about. The soldiers I respected most rarely talked that way. The strongest people I'd worked with usually didn't advertise it. They simply showed up, did their jobs, helped others, went home, no speeches required, no audience necessary, just competence. That was the lesson military service had actually taught me. Not dominance, not ego, responsibility. The work sitting on my desk affected people I would never meet. Future soldiers, future leaders, future families. That mattered more than winning an argument at a barbecue. A notification appeared on my computer screen. New historical training data available. I clicked the message. A large archive database opened. Several decades of records had recently been digitized for research purposes. Attrition rates, performance trends, historical training outcomes, useful information. The kind of information my team reviewed regularly. I started scrolling through the database, searching for comparison data from the early 1980s. What began as routine research would end up becoming the most important search of my life. The cleaning crew had already started making their rounds when I realized I was the last person left on my floor. Most of the lights in the building had switched to evening mode. The hallways were quiet. No meetings. No phones ringing. No colonels chasing deadlines. Just the soft hum of computers and the occasional squeak of a janitor's cart somewhere down the corridor. Those were usually my favorite hours. Nobody interrupted research. I leaned back in my chair and opened another historical database. The project itself was routine. My team was comparing modern basic combat training attrition trends against historical records dating back several decades. We wanted to identify long-term patterns before finalizing another revision package. Nothing exciting, just data. Thousands of names, thousands of records, thousands of people who either adapted to military life or didn't. I filtered the database. Fort Benning, 1984. Basic training washout records. A list appeared on the screen. Last names, training outcomes, administrative notes. The kind of information nobody ever reads unless they're being paid to. I scrolled. Johnson, Martinez, Fletcher, Walker, Parker. Dozens of names passed by. Then my hand stopped moving. Kensington, Roland. I stared at the screen. For a second I assumed it had to be somebody else. Kensington wasn't exactly Smith, but it wasn't impossible. The Army has millions of records. Coincidences happen. I clicked the file. The system took a few seconds to load. A scanned image appeared. Old paper, old formatting, old Army documentation. The kind of record that existed long before anyone imagined cloud storage. My eyes moved directly to the service information. Name: Roland Arthur Kensington. Date of birth: correct. Place of residence: correct. Everything matched. I sat forward. The office suddenly felt much quieter. Dad had spent my entire life talking about basic training. Every story, every lesson, every lecture. Everything traced back to those months he supposedly spent surviving military hell. I opened the next page. Training installation. Fort Benning, 1984. That matched his stories too. At first I felt relieved, almost amused. Maybe he'd actually been telling the truth. Maybe I'd spent years unfairly judging him. Then I reached the completion section. My eyes stopped. Training status: uncompleted. I blinked. Read it again. Uncompleted. That didn't make sense. Dad never talked about leaving. He talked about graduating, constantly. I clicked deeper into the archive. Additional records evaluations, administrative notes, personnel reviews. Then I found the discharge summary. My stomach tightened. Not dramatically, not like in a movie. More like the feeling you get when you realize you've been walking toward the wrong gate at an airport. A slow understanding that something isn't right. I opened the document. The official summary appeared. Week completed. 3 weeks, not 10, not 12. 3. I stared at the number. 3 weeks. The man who had spent decades bragging about surviving basic training had never made it through the first month. I kept reading. Maybe there was an injury, maybe a family emergency, maybe something legitimate. The Army doesn't consider every separation a failure. Sometimes life happens. Then I reached the reason code. Failure to adapt, administrative separation. I frowned. That wasn't a medical discharge. That wasn't a hardship discharge. That wasn't a family emergency. I opened the supporting documentation. Several scanned pages appeared. One evaluation report caught my attention. The language was clinical, professional, brutally direct. Observed severe stress reaction. Repeated refusal to participate in required training events. Unable to adapt to military environment. Recommended separation. I read it twice. Then a third time. The room remained completely silent. No dramatic music. No thunder. No shocking revelation delivered by some mysterious witness. Just black text on a government document. The truth didn't need special effects. The file continued. Multiple counseling sessions, repeated performance concerns, failure to comply with training requirements, refusal to train. The phrase appeared more than once. Refusal to train. I leaned back slowly. For years, Dad had described recruits who quit. Weak recruits, soft recruits, the ones who couldn't handle pressure, the ones who supposedly cried at night and gave up. According to his stories, he looked down on those people. According to his actual file, he had been one of them. The realization settled in piece by piece. Not all at once. That was the disturbing part. Every memory started rearranging itself. Every family gathering, every lecture, every insult, every comparison. Every time he called me soft. Every time he questioned my strength. Every time he implied I hadn't earned my place in the Army. All of it came from a man who never finished the thing he built his entire identity around. I rubbed my forehead. The file remained open, waiting, unchanging. Government records don't care about feelings. They don't care about family mythology. They don't care how many times a story gets repeated around a barbecue. They simply record what happened. And according to what happened, Roland Kensington didn't survive the mud. He didn't conquer the nightmare. He didn't endure the legendary struggle he spent 40 years describing. He lasted 3 weeks. 3. I thought about Daphne. That bothered me more than anything, because she believed him. She was preparing for one of the biggest challenges of her life, while taking advice from someone who had completely rewritten his own history. She wasn't chasing military success. She was chasing his approval. Those weren't the same thing, not even close. I looked back at the screen. Another document caught my attention, a separation interview summary, the final administrative record before discharge. The counselor's notes were short. The last sentence stood alone. Member expresses desire to return home and pursue civilian employment. That was it. No heroic ending, no dramatic sacrifice, no misunderstood warrior. Just a young man who wanted out. And honestly, that wasn't the part that upset me. People fail. People struggle. People discover they aren't suited for something. That happens every day. There was nothing shameful about being 19 years old and realizing military life wasn't for you. The shame came afterward, the decades afterward. The part where he transformed a personal disappointment into a weapon. The part where he used a fictional version of himself to make his own children feel smaller. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I printed the file. Not because I planned to use it, not because I wanted revenge, because something this significant shouldn't exist only as a digital record. The printer whirred quietly beside my desk. Page after page emerged, official, stamped, documented, real. I gathered the papers into a folder and slid them into my briefcase. The building was almost empty now. Outside, the parking lot lights had switched on. I shut down my computer and stood. For most of my life, I'd believed my father was impossible to satisfy because his standards were too high. That night, walking toward the elevator with his discharge file under my arm, I realized something much worse. The standards had never been real in the first place. The folder stayed locked inside my desk drawer for 8 days. 8 days. Not because I was afraid of what was inside, because I kept hoping I wouldn't need it. Every morning I'd arrive at work, unlock the drawer, see the corner of the file, and close it again. The truth wasn't going anywhere. The question was whether my father deserved a chance to tell it himself. By the following Sunday, I'd made my decision. One last opportunity, nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational, just an exit ramp. A chance for him to step away from the lie before it eventually crushed him. Dad had invited Daphne and me to dinner at his house. The dining room looked exactly the same as it had 10 years earlier. Same oak table, same framed photos, same grandfather clock in the corner that always ran about 4 minutes fast. The only noticeable difference was Daphne. Her departure date was getting closer. The excitement she displayed at the Labor Day cookout had started mixing with something else. She checked her phone more than usual, asked more questions than usual, laughed a little less than usual. Nothing dramatic, just enough to notice. Dad carried a casserole dish to the table. Dig in. We started eating. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation stayed harmless. Football, traffic. A neighbor who somehow managed to back his truck into his own mailbox twice in 1 month. Dad enjoyed that story. Mostly because it wasn't about him. Then Daphne put down her fork. Did either of you have trouble sleeping before big life changes? Dad immediately answered. No. I almost smiled. Of course he didn't. According to Dad's stories, he'd entered every challenge with the confidence of a movie hero. Daphne looked unconvinced. I've been waking up around 3 in the morning. Dad waved a hand. You're overthinking. Maybe. Maybe not. The military is a major life transition. Fear would be normal. Uncertainty would be normal. Even confidence and fear often arrive together. I took a sip of iced tea. Then I saw the opening, a small one, but real. I turned toward Dad. Did you ever get nervous before training? The room became quiet, not awkward, just attentive. Dad looked up from his plate. Nervous? Sure. I shrugged. Big change, new environment, new expectations. Daphne glanced toward him, interested. Listening. Waiting. I kept my voice casual. No accusations, no traps, no pressure. Just a simple question. One honest answer could change everything. He could have said yes. That was all it would have taken. Yes, I was nervous. Everyone was. Training was harder than I expected. Something human, something real, something his daughter could actually use. Instead, I watched his expression tighten, just slightly, like a muscle pulling against resistance. His fork stopped moving. The atmosphere shifted. Not because of what I'd said, because of what he'd heard. A normal person hears a question. Dad heard a challenge. The mythology had become that fragile. He sat back in his chair. Nervous? He repeated. Then he laughed. Not warmly, not naturally, the kind of laugh people use when they're buying time. I nodded. Okay. Another exit ramp, another chance. He ignored it. I was prepared. There it was. Daphne smiled slightly. Dad continued. That's the difference. I didn't ask. He would tell us anyway. People like Dad never leave blanks unfilled. The army wasn't some terrifying mystery. He pointed toward Daphne. You either have what it takes or you don't. I could practically see her trying to absorb every word, not because the advice was useful, because it came from him. I tried one final time. Sometimes people can have what it takes and still feel anxious. Dad's eyes shifted toward me, slowly. The same look he'd given me at the cookout. The same look he'd given me my entire life. The look that said the conversation had stopped being about facts. Now it was about hierarchy. And he thought I'd crossed a line. His chair scraped against the floor. He stood. Daphne looked startled. So did I. Not because he was angry, because his reaction was so disproportionate. I'd offered him every opportunity imaginable. He rejected all of them. Dad pointed directly at me. You know what your problem is? There it was. The speech. I stayed silent. That usually encouraged him to keep going. You think reading reports makes you an expert. Daphne shifted uncomfortably. Dad didn't notice or didn't care. You sit behind a computer all day and convince yourself you understand hardship. I folded my hands together, still giving him room, still hoping he'd stop. He didn't. In fact, he accelerated, the way people sometimes do when they're protecting something fragile. Never listen to your sister about military life. He looked directly at Daphne. Never. The word hung in the air. Dad jabbed a finger toward me. She's a glorified secretary. The room went completely silent. She hides behind a computer and pushes paperwork. His voice grew louder. She knows absolutely nothing about real suffering. I looked at Daphne, not Dad. Daphne, because her reaction mattered more. For the first time all evening, she wasn't smiling. She wasn't agreeing either. She just looked confused. As if part of her wanted to believe him, and another part wasn't entirely sure anymore. Dad mistook her silence for support, a dangerous mistake. He kept going. I've lived it. The words landed heavily. I've survived things she couldn't imagine. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because the file was sitting in my briefcase less than 10 feet away. 3 weeks, failure to adapt, refusal to train. The facts existed whether he acknowledged them or not. Dad kept talking, building another layer onto the lie, then another, then another. Every sentence made his eventual fall harder. Every exaggeration made the truth sharper. And the strangest part? I wasn't angry anymore. A week earlier I might have been. Now I just felt tired. Because I finally understood something. The military file wasn't going to destroy Roland Kensington. Roland Kensington was doing that himself. I had offered him dignity. I had offered him honesty. I had offered him a chance to become a father instead of a character in his own legend. He rejected all of it. The conversation drifted elsewhere after that. Nobody mentioned training again. Nobody mentioned fear again. But while Dad kept talking through dinner, I quietly reached a conclusion. The next time he chose to perform his mythology in public, I wasn't going to stop him. I wasn't even going to interrupt. I was simply going to let reality enter the room. The folding chairs were already full by the time I walked into the VFW hall. Dad had gone all out. That should have been my first warning. A large banner stretched across the far wall. Congratulations, Deepney. Red, white, and blue balloons lined the stage. A sheet cake sat on a decorated table near the entrance. Someone had even hired a local photographer. The guest list was far bigger than I expected. Family members, neighbors, church friends, a city council member, a county commissioner who seemed determined to shake every hand in the building. And scattered throughout the crowd were several veterans wearing service caps from different eras. Dad loved that. Nothing elevated a story quite like an audience that understood the vocabulary. I spotted Daphne near the refreshment table. She looked nice, professional, confident. But there was something different about her. The excitement from Labor Day had been replaced by concentration. She wasn't talking about glory anymore. She was asking practical questions, packing lists, travel dates, reporting procedures. The closer training got, the more real it became. Reality tends to do that. She waved when she saw me. Glad you came. Wouldn't miss it. That answer was true. Just not for the reason she thought. I noticed Dad moving through the crowd, shaking hands, laughing loudly, retelling stories, collecting attention the way some people collect baseball cards. Every few minutes, he glanced toward the growing audience and seemed pleased with himself. The event was technically for Daphne, but the energy already felt familiar. A retirement party that somehow became a tribute to the organizer. A wedding where someone else grabs the microphone. A birthday cake with the wrong name on it. Dad had a gift for turning other people's milestones into supporting roles. Then I saw Tobias Fletcher. He sat alone near the back wall, early 70s, trim, gray hair, Vietnam veteran cap. Unlike Dad, Tobias never looked comfortable in crowds. I recognized him immediately. He'd been around when I was a kid, fishing trips, barbecues, holiday gatherings. Back then I remembered him as the quiet friend. The one who listened more than he spoke. The one who occasionally looked uncomfortable whenever Dad launched into one of his military stories. Tobias noticed me and gave a small nod. I returned it. Something about his expression lingered, like he was carrying a conversation he never wanted to have. The event continued. People ate, people mingled, people congratulated Daphne. For almost an hour, things remained relatively normal. Then Dad found a microphone. Every family disaster in history has probably started with someone finding a microphone. The feedback squealed briefly. Conversations stopped. Dad smiled. The performance had officially begun. Thank you all for coming. Polite applause. He pointed toward Daphne. We're here to celebrate something special. More applause. Daphne smiled. Dad continued. When she told me she'd been accepted, I wasn't surprised, of course not. Nothing ever surprised Dad when the outcome was positive. I knew she had the toughness. He paced slowly across the small stage. The discipline, the character, the grit. There was that word again, grit, his favorite invisible family heirloom. The crowd nodded along, then the speech started drifting. Not abruptly, gradually, like a boat losing its mooring. Dad began talking about military service, then basic training, then resilience, then suffering. Then somehow, without anyone noticing exactly when it happened, he was talking about himself, again. The room listened politely. A few veterans exchanged glances. Daphne's smile faded slightly. She noticed it too. This wasn't her story anymore. It was becoming another chapter in Roland Kensington's greatest hits collection. Dad described cold mornings, drill sergeants, mud, pressure, determination. Every sentence made him sound more heroic than the last. The stories had evolved over the years, like fish getting larger every time they're retold. Then I noticed Tobias. He wasn't looking at Dad. He was staring at the floor. His jaw tightened, his shoulders slumped. The expression lasted only a few seconds. But it told me everything he knew. Not details, not rumors, the truth, the actual truth. Dad eventually reached the climax of his speech. The military teaches you who you really are. Applause followed. Dad soaked it in, then he smiled. A dangerous smile. The kind that usually meant someone was about to become a target. I had seen it my entire life. His eyes found me almost immediately. There it is. The room followed his, every head turned. Daphne isn't the only military member in the family. A few people chuckled. I stayed seated. Dad bent down behind the podium and pulled out a large wrapped package. The crowd looked curious. I already knew I wasn't going to enjoy this. He removed the wrapping paper dramatically. A framed certificate appeared. The audience laughed before they even knew what it was. Dad held it high. A giant gold seal sat in the center. Across the top, in oversized letters, Keyboard Warrior of the Year. More laughter. Not cruel laughter. The nervous kind. The kind people use when they're trapped. Dad waved me toward the stage. Come on up here, Sloan. I didn't move immediately. Eventually, I stood and walked forward. The room watched. Dad handed me the frame. I looked down. Someone had gone through considerable effort. There was even fake calligraphy, a mock citation, several typing jokes. A small plastic keyboard glued into the corner. Very creative. Dad grinned into the microphone. While Daphne is heading into the mud to become a real soldier. A few people shifted uncomfortably. The family wanted to recognize Sloane's bravery in typing. Scattered laughter followed, then silence. The joke had officially overstayed its welcome. I looked at the certificate, then at the crowd, then at Daphne. She wasn't laughing. She looked trapped, embarrassed, unsure whether to defend me or protect Dad. A terrible position to put someone in at their own celebration. Then I looked toward Tobias. He still hadn't raised his head. His eyes remained fixed on the floor. Like a man sitting through a funeral nobody else realized was happening. The room felt smaller now, hotter. Every joke had stopped being funny. Every smile looked forced. Dad mistook the silence for victory. That was his final mistake. Because standing there with that ridiculous frame in my hands, I realized something important. The file wasn't going to surprise him. He already knew what was inside. The file wasn't going to expose him. He'd been exposing himself all evening. The file was simply going to end the argument. I set the framed certificate against the podium and looked at my father. For years I'd chosen restraint. For years I'd chosen silence. For years I'd chosen dignity over confrontation. A week ago I'd even offered mercy. He rejected it. Publicly, repeatedly, enthusiastically. Standing under the fluorescent lights of that VFW hall, surrounded by family, veterans, local officials, and a daughter preparing to leave for military training, I finally accepted a simple reality. The time for grace had officially expired. The framed certificate felt surprisingly heavy for something so ridiculous. I set it carefully against the podium. Not tossed, not slammed, just placed there. The room watched. Dad still wore the smile of a man who thought he'd won. I reached down beside my chair and picked up my bag. Nobody spoke. The silence had changed. A few minutes earlier it had been awkward. Now it felt expectant. Like people suddenly realized they had wandered into a conversation much larger than the joke. Dad chuckled into the microphone. "Come on, Sloan. It was just a little fun." I nodded. "Of course." My voice stayed calm. That seemed to make him nervous. People expect anger. People know how to respond to anger. Calmness is harder. I opened my bag and removed a thick red-bound manual. Several people immediately recognized it as something official. The cover alone looked intimidating. Government printings, reference tabs, revision box, nearly 4 inches thick. I turned toward Daphne. Not Dad. Daphne. Because this had always been about her. I handed her the manual. She accepted it automatically. Then her eyebrows lifted when she felt the weight. "What is this?" she asked. "The next 10 weeks of your life." A few people laughed softly. Nobody else did. I could see her reading the cover. Basic combat training development and assessment protocols. Official use documentation. Revision control copy. She looked confused. Dad looked annoyed. I stepped toward the microphone. The room became quiet. Not because I demanded attention, because nobody seemed entirely sure what was happening. I looked directly at my sister. Week 1. My voice carried across the hall. "You'll be overloaded with information almost immediately." Daphne blinked. I continued. "Names, procedures, expectations, equipment accountability, reporting standards, movement standards, safety requirements." The room remained still. "You'll spend most of the first week convinced everyone else understands more than you do." A veteran near the back nodded slightly. I saw it. "So will most of the people standing beside you." Another nod. "You won't sleep as much as you're used to." I tapped the manual. "Not because somebody wants to torture you, because military schedules compress time." I looked at Daphne. "Your brain will start making mistakes before your body does." The room was listening now, really listening. No jokes, no laughter, just attention. I continued. "By week 3, you'll hit your first major wall." My eyes shifted briefly toward Dad, then back to Daphne. Not physically. I shook my head. Mentally. She swallowed. I noticed. "You'll wonder if you're keeping up. You'll compare yourself to people around you. You'll question whether you belong there." The veteran at the back nodded again. This time, several others joined him. Because they knew. Not the movie version. The real version, I continued. "Your feet will hurt." A few veterans laughed quietly. "That's normal." More laughter. "Your shoulders will hurt." Another chuckle. "Everything attached to your feet and shoulders will hurt too." Even Daphne smiled. Good. That part was important. Reality isn't dramatic all the time. Sometimes it's just uncomfortable. I kept going. "By the middle phase, you'll discover something interesting." "What?" she asked it almost automatically. "The strongest person isn't always the fastest." I paused. The strongest person is usually the one who keeps showing up. A few people exchanged looks. That landed differently. Because it was true. I turned another page in the manual. These sections cover sleep management metrics. Several guests looked surprised. Sleep metrics? Not exactly what people imagine when they hear military training. We track cognitive degradation. I pointed toward the document. Decision accuracy. Retention rates. Stress adaptation benchmarks. Dad shifted uncomfortably. I noticed. Everyone noticed. I continued anyway. Every obstacle, every exercise, every evaluation, every schedule block, every stress event, they're all measured. Daphne looked down at the manual, then back at me. How do you know all this? That was the moment. The entire room seemed to lean forward, even the politicians, even the photographer, even Tobias finally lifted his head. I looked at my sister. Then I spoke into the microphone, slowly, clearly. I know this because I designed it. Silence. Not a sound, no coughs, no shifting chairs, nothing, I continued. I am Major Sloan Kensington. Still silence. I serve at Tradoc. A few veterans immediately recognized the name. Their expressions changed. I lead one of the development teams responsible for basic combat training assessment protocols. More silence. The room seemed frozen. I gestured toward the manual in Daphne's hands. My team helped build the framework you're about to enter. Nobody laughed now. The joke certificate, leaning against the podium, suddenly looked very small. Dad blinked, then forced a laugh, too quickly, too loudly, the laugh of someone trying to regain control. Oh, come on. He stepped forward. Reading a few books doesn't make you an expert. Nobody joined the laugh. Dad pressed forward anyway. Real training. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. Instead, I reached into my bag again. My fingers found the folder immediately. Thin, yellowed, worn from decades of storage. The same folder that had spent more than a week sitting in my desk drawer. The same folder I never wanted to use. The same folder he forced me to bring. I placed it on the table beside the microphone. The sound wasn't dramatic, just paper touching wood, but every head turned. Dad stopped speaking. The room went completely still. His eyes locked onto the folder. Something changed in his expression. But I saw it. Recognition. Not certainty. Not yet. Just recognition. Like a man's spotting a storm cloud he hoped wasn't moving toward him. I rested one hand on top of the folder. Then I looked directly at him. Not angrily, not triumphantly, almost sadly, because this could have ended differently, many times. At the cookout, at dinner. A dozen other moments across 20 years. I had given him every chance. He had rejected everyone. The microphone amplified my voice across the hall. Soft, steady, impossible to misunderstand. Real training, I said. Lasts longer than 3 weeks, Roland. The color disappeared from his face, and for the first time all night, Roland Kensington's had absolutely nothing to say. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The silence inside the VFW hall felt heavier than anything Dad had said all evening. My hand remained on top of the folder. Roland stared at it, not at me, not at the crowd. The folder. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking at a man preparing another speech. I was looking at a man trying to calculate whether the truth had finally caught up to him. Slowly, I opened it. The sound of paper sliding against paper seemed unusually loud. A few guests leaned forward. Others sat perfectly still. I pulled out the first page, yellowed, official, stamped, 42 years old and somehow more powerful than every story Roland Kensington had ever told. I didn't hold it up dramatically. I didn't wave it around. I simply placed it on the table in front of him. Then I stepped back. That was enough. His eyes dropped immediately, straight to the center of the page. The stamp, the classification, the administrative summary. I watched the recognition arrive. Not surprise, recognition. The kind that comes when someone encounters a truth they've been running from for decades. The color drained from his face. It happened so fast several people around him noticed. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. No speech, no comeback, no joke, nothing. The man who always had something to say suddenly had nothing. Across the room, Tobias Fletcher lowered his head. Then came a sound I had never heard from him before. A long, exhausted sigh, not dramatic, not theatrical, just tired. The sound of someone carrying a secret for far too long. Several heads turned toward him. Tobias looked up, settled on Roland. Then he shook his head once, just once. That was all. No accusations, no speeches, no need. His reaction confirmed everything. The room understood it immediately. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an error. This wasn't some complicated military technicality. This was the truth. And Tobias had known it all along. Daphne stepped closer to the table. The manual I had given her was still tucked under one arm. She looked down at the file, then at Dad, then back to the file, again and again, like someone trying to force two completely different realities to fit together. What's this? Her voice sounded small. Nobody answered. She looked directly at Roland. Dad? Nothing. The silence itself became an answer. Daphne picked up the top page. I watched her eyes move across the document, training stats, administrative separation. Week completed. 3. Her face changed, not instantly, gradually, the way a window slowly fogs over. The confidence from Labor Days disappeared. The certainty disappeared, the mythology disappeared. She wasn't discovering that her father had failed. She was discovering that her father had lied. Those are very different things. Failure is human. Lying about it for 40 years is a choice, a painful one. She looked up. Dad? Still nothing. I had never seen him like this, not once. No anger, no sarcasm, no superiority, no lecture. His shoulders had collapsed inward. His posture seemed smaller, older, almost fragile. The crowd remained frozen. Even the politicians had stopped pretending to network. Nobody wanted to be anywhere else. Nobody knew where else to look. Then Roland finally spoke. Just 3 words. I was young. The sentence landed softly. Not because it was powerful. Because it was true. For the first time all night, it was true. Nobody criticized him. Nobody mocked him. Nobody attacked him. Because being young and overwhelmed isn't shameful. Every veteran in that room understood that. Every soldier understands fear. Every soldier understands failure. Every soldier understands doubt. The tragedy wasn't what happened in 1984. The tragedy was everything he built afterward. Daphne's eyes filled with questions. Not tears. Questions. Thousands of them. Questions about childhood. Questions about family. Questions about every lecture she'd ever received. Questions about every comparison. Questions about every time Dad had measured our worth against a version of himself that never existed. She sat down slowly. The manual rested in her lap. The file remained open on the table. Reality sat between them. I realized there was nothing left to say about the records. The records had already done their job. The facts were finished speaking. I stepped away from the podium. Away from the microphone. Away from the file. The crowd watched me. Maybe expecting a victory speech. Maybe expecting revenge. Maybe expecting years of frustration to finally explode. Instead, felt I strangely calm. Because none of this was actually about winning. Winning what? An argument? A family feud? A competition I never entered? The truth had never needed my help. It only needed a room. I looked at Daphne first, then Tobias. Finally, I looked at Dad. The man who had spent decades trying to convince everyone he was unbreakable. The man who never realized that pretending to be strong and actually being strong were 2 completely different things. I spoke one final time. Not loudly, just clearly. True strength isn't a ghost story you invent to make your children feel small. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The room stayed silent. It's the quiet endurance you carry when nobody is watching. Dad lowered his eyes. Tobias closed his. Daphne stared at the floor. I picked up my bag. Then I walked toward the exit. No applause followed. No dramatic confrontation. No last-second argument. Just silence. The honest kind. The doors opened. Cool night air met me outside. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. Not because my father had been exposed. Because I was finally free from defending myself against a myth. Behind me, inside that hall, Roland Kensington remained surrounded by the story he had spent 40 years building. Except now everyone could see the foundation. A frightened 19-year-old who didn't make it through 3 weeks of training. There was never any shame in that. The shame came from using the lie to make other people feel smaller. I walked across the parking lot toward my car. The night was quiet. No speeches. No audience, no mythology, just reality. And reality, I had learned, was more than enough. The highway was almost empty on the drive home. A few headlights passed in the opposite direction. The radio stayed off. For the first time that entire night, nobody was talking. Not Dad, not Daphne, not me, just silence. The funny thing is, after spending years imagining what it would feel like to expose a lie that big, the feeling wasn't what most people would expect. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't replaying the moment in my head. I wasn't thinking about winning. I kept thinking about a 19-year-old kid in 1984. A kid who showed up to basic training and realized he couldn't handle it. Because here's something a lot of people get wrong about this story. The worst thing my father ever did wasn't failing. It was lying about it. Those are not the same thing. Not even close. Failure is normal. Failure is human. Failure is one of the most common experiences on Earth. Every successful person you've ever admired has failed at something. Sometimes badly, sometimes publicly, sometimes repeatedly. Businesses fail, marriages fail, careers fail, people fail exams. People get fired, people lose money, people make terrible decisions. Life doesn't hand out immunity cards. Nobody gets through it undefeated. The military taught me that very early. One of the strongest officers I ever worked with failed Ranger School on his first attempt. One of the smartest civilian analysts in our department was nearly fired from her first government position. A senior commander I deeply respected once told me he almost quit during his first year in uniform. Failure didn't make those people weak. In many ways, it made them stronger. Because failure forces you to learn something success often doesn't. Humility. That's why I couldn't stop thinking about my father. If Roland Kensington had simply told the truth, I honestly believe I would have respected him more. Imagine hearing this growing up. I joined the army when I was young. I thought I was tougher than I was. I struggled. I didn't make it, but I learned from it. Do you know what kind of lesson that would have taught me? A useful one, a real one. Instead, I got something else. I got mythology. And mythology is dangerous when it's used as a parenting tool, because children don't compare themselves to reality. They compare themselves to the story. That's exactly what happened in our family. My father didn't compare me to the man he actually was. He compared me to the man he invented. And nobody can compete with an invention. An invented hero never makes mistakes. An invented hero never doubts himself. An invented hero never gets scared. An invented hero always wins. That's a brutal standard to grow up around. Not because it's difficult, because it's impossible. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this happens in families all over America. Not always with military stories. Sometimes it's business success. Sometimes it's sports. Sometimes it's relationships. Parents quietly edit their past, not because they're evil, usually because they're embarrassed. They remove the failures, delete the mistakes, polish the rough edges. Then they hand the finished version to their children. The problem is that children learn the wrong lesson. They start believing successful people never struggle. They start believing fear is weakness. They start believing mistakes mean they're not good enough. None of that is true. One of the best conversations I ever had happened with a retired colonel named James Whitaker. He had commanded thousands of soldiers during his career, decorations, awards, the whole package. One afternoon, he told a group of young officers something I'll never forget. He said, "Your people don't need you to be perfect. They need you to be honest." That sentence stuck with me, because leadership and parenting are surprisingly similar. In both situations, people are watching how you handle adversity, not how you pretend adversity never happened. Imagine a father telling his daughter, "I lost my business when I was 32. Imagine a mother saying, "I got fired from a job I loved." Imagine a parent admitting, "I made mistakes." Those conversations don't weaken families. They strengthen them. Because they teach resilience, they teach recovery, they teach reality. The truth gives people something they can actually use. A lie only gives them something they have to maintain, and maintaining a lie gets expensive. Not financially. Emotionally. Every year my father had to protect the story. Every challenge to the story became a threat. Every disagreement became personal. Every success someone else achieved became dangerous, especially mine, because my existence created a problem. The more I accomplished, the harder it became to maintain the version of himself he wanted everyone to believe. Now, looking back, I almost feel sorry for him. Almost. Not because he failed. Because he spent 4 decades imprisoned by a decision he made after the failure. The decision to hide it. A truthful failure lasts a moment. A protected lie lasts a lifetime. And that's probably the biggest lesson I took from everything that happened. The truth might embarrass you today. It might make you uncomfortable. It might force difficult conversations. But eventually the truth becomes lighter. Lies do the opposite. They get heavier every year, heavier every birthday, heavier every family gathering, heavier every time you have to defend them. By the time I pulled into my driveway that night, I realized something important. The military file didn't destroy my father's reputation. The lie did that. The file simply arrived to collect the bill. And somewhere across town, my sister was beginning to understand that the strongest thing a person can say isn't, "I never failed." Sometimes it's simply, "I did." And that's where real growth begins. 3 weeks later, my phone buzzed while I was reviewing a training's assessment report. The message was from Daphne. Not a group text, not a family update. Just Daphne. "Can we talk when you have time?" I stared at the screen for a moment. For years, most of our conversations had revolved around Dad, usually without either of us admitting it. Every achievement, every disagreement, every family gathering, He somehow occupied the center of the room, even when he wasn't physically there, I replied. Call me after dinner. Her coffee came at 7:43 that evening. I still remember the exact time because the conversation ended up staying with me for a long time. We talked about training first. The food, the schedule, the people she'd met, the things that surprised her. Then there was a pause, not an awkward one. The kind people leave when they're deciding whether to ask something difficult. Finally, she said it. How did you do it? Do what? Stay quiet all those years. I leaned back in my chair. Of all the questions I expected, that wasn't one of them. What makes you think I stayed quiet? She laughed softly. You know what I mean. I did. She wasn't talking about silence. She was talking about survival. How do you spend years being told who you are by someone else and still know yourself afterward? That's a harder question than people realize. I thought about it for a moment. Then I answered honestly. It took me longer than it should have. She didn't interrupt, so I continued. The biggest mistake I made was believing I needed Dad to change before I could move forward. Another pause, because that one landed. I could tell. Then I said something I wish I'd understood much earlier. Every family has a story. What do you mean? I smiled. Because once you notice it, you see it everywhere. Some families tell themselves they're tougher than everyone else. Some families insist they're smarter than everyone else. Some families believe they're always the victims. Others believe they're always the heroes. The details change, the pattern doesn't. I explained it to Daphne the same way I explain complex concepts to young officers. Simple, direct. Every family has a myth. She was quiet, listening. I continued. Maybe it's the story that Grandpa was always right. Maybe it's the story that Mom sacrificed more than anyone. Maybe it's the story that one child is the successful one. Maybe it's the story that your family is stronger than other families. Eventually, everybody starts acting around the story instead of around reality. She immediately understood, because she'd just watched our family myth collapse in real time. For decades, the story had been simple. Roland Kensington was the toughest person in the room. Everything else flowed from that assumption. His opinions mattered more. His criticisms mattered more. His judgments mattered more. Questioning him felt almost illegal, because questioning the myth threatened the entire structure. The dangerous part wasn't the lie itself. The dangerous part was what the lie prevented. Nobody could admit weakness. Nobody could challenge assumptions. Nobody could have an honest conversation. Because honesty and mythology don't coexist very well. Eventually, one of them has to leave, Daphne sighed. I don't know what to believe anymore. That sentence broke my heart a little. Not because she was confused, because she wasn't confused. She was finally seeing clearly, and clarity can be uncomfortable at first. I told her something I wish someone had told me years ago. You don't have to decide whether Dad is a good person or a bad person. What? You don't. She laughed nervously. That seems a little too simple. Maybe. I shrugged, even though she couldn't see it. But people waste years trying to sort other human beings into categories. Good, bad, strong, weak, hero, failure. Reality rarely works that way. The truth was that Roland Kensington had failed at basic training. The truth was also that he had worked hard throughout his life. The truth was that he loved his daughters. The truth was also that he hurt them. Human beings are messy. Most of us are walking contradictions. The real lesson wasn't about judging him. The lesson was about refusing to build our identities around his version of reality. That was the trap. And it wasn't unique to our family. I think there are people watching this story right now who know exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe someone spent years telling you that you weren't smart enough. Maybe someone convinced you that you weren't attractive enough. Maybe someone repeatedly informed you that you were lazy, weak, difficult, selfish, dramatic, irresponsible, or destined to fail. If you hear something often enough, eventually it starts sounding like a fact, even when it isn't. That's why family myths are so powerful. They don't just shape how we see other people. They shape how we see ourselves. And sometimes the most important thing you'll ever do is ask one simple question. Whose voice am I hearing? Is it reality, or is it someone else's insecurity talking? That question changed my life. Because once I stopped measuring myself against the version of me that existed in Dad's stories, something strange happened. I became free, not successful, not perfect, free. Free to succeed, free to fail, free to learn, free to become whoever I was actually meant to become. Before we hung up, Daphne said something that made me smile. I think training is easier than family sometimes. I laughed. Honestly, she wasn't completely wrong. Because military training teaches you how to carry weight. Family myths teach you to carry weight that was never yours to begin with. And learning the difference can change everything. My phone vibrated during a meeting break about 6 weeks later. The message was short, very short. In fact, if you didn't know the story behind it, you probably wouldn't think much of it. It was from Daphne. Today was hard, still here. That was it. No dramatic speech, no heroic story, no motivational quote, just 6 words. Today was hard, still here. I stared at the screen for a second and smiled. Because after everything that happened, after all the stories, all the arguments, all the mythology, those 6 words contained more truth than 40 years of family legends. That was real strength. Not perfection, not domination, not pretending you're fearless. Just showing up when things are difficult and continuing anyway. One of the strange things about getting older is that your definition of strength changes. When you're young, strength often looks loud. It's the person who talks the biggest, the person who wins every argument, the person who always has an answer, the person who never admits weakness. A lot of us grow up believing that's what strong people look like. I certainly did. For years, my father looked strong to me, not because of what he did, because of how confidently he talked about it. Confidence can be very convincing, especially when you're a child. Children don't have enough life experience to separate confidence from competence, or confidence from honesty, or confidence from character. They often assume those things come together. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. Life eventually teaches the difference. The military certainly taught me. Some of the strongest people I've ever known would never describe themselves that way. One of the best officers I ever worked with spent every Friday evening calling the parents of struggling soldiers just to make sure someone was checking on them. Nobody gave him awards for that. Nobody applauded. He just did it. A combat veteran I deeply respect once spent 3 hours helping a young private study for an exam after everyone else went home. Nobody posted it online. Nobody celebrated it. He simply saw someone who needed help. Those moments taught me something important. Real strength is usually quiet. It's rarely interested in advertising itself. And that's a lesson that applies far beyond military service. Maybe you're dealing with a difficult marriage right now. Real strength isn't pretending everything is fine. It's having the difficult conversation you've been avoiding. Maybe you're struggling financially. Real strength isn't protecting your pride. It's asking for help before the situation gets worse. Maybe you're raising children. Real strength isn't convincing them you're perfect. It's teaching them how to recover after mistakes. Because they will make mistakes. So will you. That's called being human. One of the biggest lessons from my story with Roland is something I wish more people understood. Your children do not need a superhero. They need a guide. A superhero has no flaws. A guide has experience. A superhero pretends they never struggle. A guide shows you how to move through struggle. Those are completely different things. And if you're a parent watching this, I hope you'll remember that. Your honesty may help your children more than your accomplishments ever will. The same principle applies to leadership, business, friendships, relationships, even personal growth. People connect with authenticity, not perfection. Nobody learns from your highlight reel. They learn from your scars, provided you're honest about where they came from. I think that's why Daphne's message stayed with me. Today was hard. Still here, there was no ego in it. No performance, no audience, no mythology, just reality. And reality is where growth actually happens. Not in the stories we tell about ourselves, not in the image we try to protect, not in the version of ourselves we hope other people believe. Growth happens when reality meets responsibility, when we stop asking, "How do I look?" and start asking, "Who am I becoming?" That's a much better question, because appearances change, reputations change, public opinions change, character stays. If you've watched this entire story, I hope you'll take one thing with you. Don't spend your life protecting an image. Spend your life building substance. An image can disappear in a single day. Substance stays with you forever. And if someone in your life has spent years convincing you that you're weak, incapable, or not enough, remember this. The loudest voice in the room is not always the most truthful one. Sometimes the strongest person is the one quietly carrying their responsibilities while nobody is paying attention. Sometimes the strongest person is the one who keeps showing up, just like Daphne did. just like countless ordinary people do every single day. And maybe that's the real reason this story mattered. Not because a lie was exposed, but because the truth finally got a chance to breathe. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey. I'd genuinely love to know your thoughts. What was the biggest lesson you took from this story? Share it in the comments below. If you enjoy meaningful family stories that explore character, resilience, accountability, and real-life lessons, not cheap drama, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We publish new stories every day at 8:30 a.m. ET and 1:30 p.m. ET. Make us part of your daily routine, and I'll see you in the next story.